me just simply start out very briefly to reiterate what Stephanie just said. Hopefully, if you haven't yet read A Mid-Rage, or if you haven't yet read Nightshade, then I hope you will buy that from Malaprops or from your local indie bookstore, but especially from Malaprops. So Michael, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good, sir. I hope you are.
I am well. It's a pleasure to appear with you. For those of us, you who don't know us, we've actually known each other now for a period of time, but this is the first time we're actually appearing together. So it'll be fun having a conversation with Michael. But why don't we get started? And Michael, if you could tell everyone about your latest book, Nightshade, and describe something about the book and tell us what's all about.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I just happen to have a copy of Nightshade right here. Look at this gorgeous cover. Nightshade is the second book in the series that follows my main character, a woman named Livy Nash. Livy was a British spy during World War II. The British, and to some extent the United States, recruited amateurs to be spies and dropped them behind enemy lines in places like France, Poland, Yugoslavia, other occupied countries. My books primarily take place in the very early years of the Cold War, because after World War II, Livy comes home, and of course, gender roles being what they were in the mid-40s, the intelligence services wouldn't give her the time of day. So she meets Ian Fleming, the man who would go on to write the James Bond novels, and Fleming recruits her to spy once again for her country. Nightshade, which is the second book in the series, finds Livy kind of on the search for her best friend, a woman that she met during training for World War II, who was listed as missing, presumed dead at the end of the war, which is true, which happened to many of these spies and saboteurs who were dropped behind enemy lines. So 2 years after the war ends, Livy's friend, Margot, her signal is suddenly heard by a wireless operator out in the ether, her code signal. And so Livy is given the task of trying to find out where did that signal come from and if Margot is still out there and still alive. Should I go ahead and read a bit from it now, Joel? What do you think?
Why don't you? I'd love to hear some passages from it.
All right, I'm going to read it. I'm going to keep it short and sweet, ladies and gentlemen. This is the prologue. 1943. Livy Nash sat on a hill above a runway somewhere outside of Manchester and wished she was going to Paris. The summer night air chilled, even though the sky was clear and the moon bright enough to light her plane's way across the channel. She had to wait for that flight, though. Still 2 nights before her scheduled departure. She spent the last months training for this moment and for what lay beyond, when she would finally find herself on the ground in occupied France. She felt ready, anxious. Give her a plane, she'd fly the damn thing herself. But this wasn't her night. It was Margot's. They'd arranged to meet on this hillside just after the final briefing. Margot was late, as usual. She had a unique relationship with time. They were more casual acquaintances than actual friends. For a moment, Livy wondered if she would come at all. Margot had gone pale at dinner and wouldn't touch the evening rations. Livy made jokes about the taste and compared it to her Aunt Rosie's bangers and mash. Feed that to the Jerrys, and the war is over tomorrow. Can't fight if you run into the loo every 5 minutes, she'd said. The joke seemed to improve Margot's power. She liked jokes like that. The raunchier, the better. So there you go. That's a bit of Nightshade. Now, Joel, why don't you tell us about A Mid-Rage?
Well, that's a great taste, and I'm looking forward to reading that. I did read your first book, as you know, and very much enjoyed it. And we'll talk about that as we progress tonight. But my book, A Mid-Rage, follows Mike Jacobs. Mike is a 28-year-old environmental lawyer who's a prosecutor with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Mike is placed in a really untenable position. A mining company has applied for a coal mining permit. They didn't like it, so they filed an appeal from the permit conditions. On the other hand, the neighbors saw that a permit was issued. They didn't like that a permit was issued at all, and they filed an appeal from the permit. So now you have a three-way appeal. You have the mining company on the one side, you've got the neighbors on the other side, and you've got the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, stuck in the middle. And Mike is supposed to defend that permit and also represent the Commonwealth in this case. And he's placed really in an impossible position, one that many state agency and EPA lawyers often find themselves when a permit is issued. And so it's not a completely unusual situation, although the public generally isn't aware of it. In this case, we have the mine operator, a man named Ernie Renati, and Ernie is a genuine psychopath. He's a real vile, evil man, but for one thing, his love for his three-legged dog, Butch. And the neighbors, on the other hand, they're not exactly model citizens either. They've got some issues as well. Their lawyers are interesting characters. One is Sid Feldman. He's a Philadelphia lawyer through and through, and he's representing Ernie and the mining company called Rhino Mining Company. And then the citizens are represented by Miranda Clymer, who's a mysterious woman that is seems to be handling her very first piece of litigation. And Mike is representing the Commonwealth, and he has working with him his best friend, Nikki Kane, who's a paralegal and also his best friend and ultimately becomes his roommate, which creates some interesting circumstances. In any event, Mike is trying, what Mike really and truly would like to do is to defend the environment and defend the citizens. But he is told to his face, point blank, we are not doing that. We're in the middle on this case. Let the two lawyers fight it out, and you just babysit the case. Those are the words that they use, babysit the case. Defend the integrity of the department, which he says is sort of like defending the integrity of a floozy. So he's sort of stuck in the middle, and that's the setup for a mid-rage. So Michael, with your permission, I'll read a few pages from my book. Mike Jacobs white-knuckled the overhead hand grip in the DEP Jeep as it bounced across the floor of the strip mine. It felt like they were driving over logs, one after the other, fast. The mine inspector, Chris Markley, chatted away as if he were cruising down the smoothest, straightest six-lane highway. He swerved to avoid a boulder that easily could have taken out the undercarriage. Mike swallowed hard to keep his breakfast down. Hey, Chris, maybe if we slow down a bit, we can spend a little time enjoying the scenery. Mike now had his left hand on the dashboard in front of him, in addition to holding on to the overhead grip. He attempted a smile. They drove past a sign with the DEP logo on it. Mines and quarries are not playgrounds. Stay out. Stay alive. Where's the fun in that? Chris took his eyes off the narrow two-way haul road to look at Mike. The white Jeep with the DEP logo on the side bounced from rut to rut, kicking up rocks and dirt. Mike wished Chris would keep his eyes on the trail. The floor of the mine was covered with boulders and loose rock. The haul road wasn't much better, but at least it had the semblance of a trail. He tried to focus on distant points to keep from getting sick. He often heard people say that a coal strip mine resembled the surface of the moon. Hardly. This mine, Black Diamond Anthracite's Gilberton mine, was part old abandoned mine and part new workings. The abandoned part had a gray and black floor made up of waste coal and rocky overburden. Scrubby little birch trees and other vegetation that tolerated the acidic environment struggled to survive in the hostile landscape. Water pooled in depressions and turned into acidic mine water where it stood. Any that managed to make it off the mine site was hopelessly contaminated with acid, sulfur, manganese, and other metals that poisoned streams and made the water undrinkable. They drove past an abandoned car that had been set on fire. All that was left was a rusted hull. I want to make an impression with these guys, so we have to get to the high wall before the boys here have a chance to clean it up too much. We entered the mine 10 minutes ago, and you just know they're busy tidying up the mess from last night. The mess was the aftermath of a mishap with explosives. Blasting typically was done when the shift was on break or at the end of the day. Boreholes were drilled into the rock loaded with a mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, ANFO, and then blasted. This high wall had a blowout during blasting the afternoon before and sprayed fly rock about 1,000 feet onto the pit floor. Not a huge problem here since the rock didn't leave the mine and no one was hurt, but a violation nevertheless. In a more populated area, an incident like this could have been deadly. Chris would write it up and Mike probably would have to enforce any order he issued. I want to impress these guys with the fact that I brought my lawyer with me. Chris forced a wide smile at Mike and raised and lowered his eyebrows Groucho style. Mike liked Chris. He was typical of the new inspectors at DEP. He was young, in his late 20s, like Mike, with a degree in environmental science. He was also a fisherman and a hunter, and was aggressive about enforcing the law. Mike, an assistant counsel in DEP's Litigation and Enforcement Division, did all he could to support guys like Chris. What can you tell me about them, Mike said, as he tried to distract himself from the constant rumbling in his stomach. Not too awful. These guys have a couple of strippings, all in Schuylkill County, like this one. Nothing underground, maybe 5-10 men at each site. Couple of violations a year, nothing terrible. The foreman for this site, Kevin Schultz, is an asshole. Me and Schultz never see eye to eye. He won't be too happy to see us. And you heard about the Fly Rock incident? How? Mike eased his grip on the overhead as the haul road flattened out. The only thing better than a disgruntled former employee is a disgruntled current employee. Got a call on my cell last night and called you right away. I'm glad you were available to come up here first thing in the morning. They drove past a line of derelict mining equipment, standing alongside one another like in some kind of apocalyptic movie parking lot. They had been ravaged for their spare parts, their bodies turned into rust and their guts spilled onto the mine floor. Mike wondered if there were any DEP Jeeps among the junkers. The Jeep rounded an unmined outcrop. Right in front of them, no more than 50 feet away, was a D10 dozer, yellow, covered with dirt and coal dust, billowing diesel smoke from its single stack. Not the biggest dozer on the market, but significantly bigger than the Jeep, right in the middle of the haul road. Huge yellow blade at eye level, coming straight at them, fast. Chris stomped on the brake. The outcrop they were driving around prevented him from veering to the left. Huge boulders and the junk trucks prevented him from turning to the right. The Jeep skidded to a stop, sliding sideways like it was on ice. The dozer kept coming. Hold on! Chris popped the Jeep into reverse, and Mike looked over his shoulder. Directly behind them was a gigantic Deere 944 front-end loader, bucket at window height, bearing down on them. They were trapped. Oh, crap. Chris stomped on the brake, and the Jeep skidded backwards as the loader closed in from behind and the dozer from in front. Ambushed. They'd be sandwiched between the two gigantic machines, crushed, decapitated by those blades. Death in front and behind. Mike had to find a way out. And that's part of the first chapter of the book. Give you a little taste of Mike's experience and what it's like to be inside of a strip mine. And it was a lot of fun writing that. I hope it's fun for you to hear it. In any event, Michael, if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask you a few questions, and we'll go back and forth. And hopefully, if the audience has any questions, they'll type them, and Stephanie can read them to us at the end of the program, towards the end of the hour.
Absolutely. Although I have to say, I didn't know that. I knew the law was a dangerous profession, but that's really taking it to the extreme right there.
Well, and as in all fiction, there are some licenses that we take, but those kinds of things do happen.
Of course, I'm sure. Absolutely. I mean, just driving down into that mine sounded dangerous enough for someone like me. That's for sure. So, yeah. Would you like to start with the questions, or how should we do this?
Sure. Maybe since Livy Nash is your protagonist in both of your stories, maybe you could tell us the background for Nightshade, for Spitfire, rather, your first book, and how you came up with your main character, and is she based on a real person?
Yeah, Spitfire takes place the year after the war, and deals with Livy's experiences during the war. Her war, as I said, she was a spy behind enemy lines, and her war ends very badly with the death of this man she loved at the hands of a traitor. So she comes home, and she is, she's certainly depressed. We might even call it today PTSD. She's spending most of her nights with Black Marcus. When into her life walks Ian Fleming, who kind of gives her a new lease on life and a chance to go back to Paris and find the traitor that killed the man that she loved. So that's basically Spitfire, which sort of sets it up. Nightshade takes place the year after. And the thing that really, well, first of all, I'd love to give book recommendations. And after you buy my books and all of Joel's books, and at least 10 copies each. So you think 10 copies each would be good, Joel?
Definitely.
Yeah, I thought he would approve of that. I'll make a recommendation. The book that really set me off on to researching all this is a terrific novel that is classified as young adult, called Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wein. I had no idea that the British recruited women to be these sort of amateur spies. I had no idea. And why wouldn't they? Of course, but I just assumed because of the time. And so in researching it, yeah, I found several women who did these incredibly brave things. The one woman that really stuck out to me was a woman named Nancy Wake, who, like Livy, was parachuted into France behind enemy lines to do these incredibly dangerous things. And there's a story about her that I'm going to tell everyone. And I'm going to use a curse word. So, maybe this is a good time to send the kids to the kitchen or something. So when Nancy Wake parachuted into France, her parachute got caught in a tree. And it was tradition that members of the French resistance would come and meet the British spies, right, when they were landing, get them to safety really quickly before German patrol came by. And so this Frenchman saw Nancy Wake up in the tree with her parachute and said, "Oh, I wish all the trees in France bore such beautiful fruit." And Nancy Wake, the story goes, said to him, "Cut the French shit." And I thought when I read that, I want to see a character like that. So Livy is very direct. She is, I guess you could call her sort of a more of a modern woman, although in writing historical mysteries, which I guess is my genre, I would say that there were, people who didn't conform to what we think of as how people existed, at a certain time period in history.
I was interested by something when I read Spitfire, and that was, I guess the British accents that I'm used to hearing are London accents, or maybe Scottish accents or Irish, from the UK. And you do have some words that she uses that I was completely unfamiliar with. And just even the way you portrayed the words in the book. Maybe you could tell us something about that area of Britain.
Yeah, sure. Livy's from Lancashire, which is in the northwest of England. She's specifically from a town called Blackpool, which is still a resort community in England. It's seen better days. Lancashire is sort of country. I have a dear friend who unfortunately passed away the year before Spitfire was published, who a former professor of mine who introduced me to Lancashire, took me around, took me to Blackpool, and Nightshade is dedicated to him. But he used to tell me that in England, here in the United States, and I'm a North Carolinian, so I bristle a little bit at this. If you're below the Mason-Dixon line, the stereotype is you're an idiot, right? You're a hick. In England, it's the exact opposite. If you're in the south of the country, then you're sophisticated and smart. In the north of the country, you're thought of as rude. So Livy has that sort of chip on her shoulder a little bit of being somebody from the country, but she is certainly more complex than that. I think it's my turn, Joel. You want to go back and forth like this? Or
I think that'd be great. Let's do that.
No one wants to hear me talk for that long. So I'm fascinated by, you having been a lawyer and worked in environmental law. And I know from friends who have gone through the rigor of law school and the rigor of practicing law. How does that compare to the rigor of becoming a published writer and sustaining a writing career?
It helps and it hinders in many ways. Certainly my background as an environmental lawyer was very helpful to writing a mid-range in the previous book, Drink to Every Beast. The first book, Drink to Every Beast, is about dumping chemicals in a river. And mid-range is about, of course, about coal mining. The next book in the series, which is now done, called Strange Fire, is about fracking. And so I've learned about these things. I've taken a very, as they say, a very deep dive in these things. I was fortunate when I started out my career as a young lawyer to spend 3 years doing nothing other than strip mining enforcement. So when I write about being in a mine, it really comes from a lot of experience that I had many years ago going into those mines. And then later on in my career in private practice, I was not in coal mines, but I was in a lot of quarries over the years. And they're really different places. So one of the things that I like to do in my books is, well, like your book. I mean, your book, you feel like you're in England in the late part of World War II or right after World War II, or you're in Europe during the war, after the war. And I think one of the reasons that readers read our books is because they want to get the sense that they're going somewhere that's different than, their living room. And whether it is post-war Europe, or whether it is, the bottom of a strip mine, I mean, that's something that people want to experience. But in terms of my background, in terms of my writing, it's obviously it's very rigorous being a lawyer. And one thing that lawyers do is that we do a lot of writing. I gave a presentation just yesterday to students at Temple University. And the first question that I was asked was, how much writing does a lawyer do? And the fact of the matter is, lawyers do a lot of writing. I think the statistic currently is that, at least on the civil side, not the criminal side, but on the civil side, 98% of cases are settled before they go to a trial. So that means that only 2% of all of those cases that you see, other than the criminal ones on TV or in the movies, where there's a trial that's taking place, that truly is a unique situation. And most everything else is basically either done papers, or maybe appeals to appellate courts, or maybe depositions. But the vast majority of the work that's done is research and writing, even for litigators, and certainly, of course, for corporate and real estate lawyers and other lawyers as well. So being a lawyer, though, teaches you something about writing, which in fact, I was telling these students yesterday that we all take a course in the very first months of our law school career called legal writing, which probably ought to be renamed, how to suck the soul and lifeblood out of your creative writing skills, because there's a certain style to legal writing that really commands you not to be overly creative. In fact, it frowns on being creative. It wants you to do things in a very, very rote way. And you have to unlearn that, actually, to become a writer of fiction. But one thing that being a lawyer does is that it does train you how to sit in your place right here where I'm sitting at this very moment, and how to concentrate and write and write and write and just work. And I was talking to Michael earlier today and saying that I'm just finishing up right now the first draft of my latest novel. And, I get up early. I get up, 7 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock at the latest. I'm up here and I'm writing until my stomach tells me it's lunchtime. And so the rigor of being able to do that, I think, comes in part from my training as a lawyer, and just, being very task oriented and wanting to get that task done. So it's both of those things. And in terms of the environmental side, I got an environmental degree when I was in college, physical geography. And then the work that I did over the past 40 years as a lawyer all involved environmental issues. And so it was taking a deep dive in every single case, every single day, multiple subjects, from mining to geology to agronomy to water, you name it, air, climate change, all of those things, and becoming quite familiar with those subjects. So I hope that answers your question. But
yeah, absolutely. Something you said prompted another question. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to go off topic a little bit. I'm kind of fascinated by writers' routines because for those of you who have not really written anything, procrastination is one of the great writing skills. At least it's one of mine. I can't speak for you, Joel. Do you stick to a routine? I know you said you get up very early and you have that sort of lawyerly discipline. Do you have a routine that you try to stick to when you're writing a piece?
I do. And what I've learned, it's entirely different than when I was practicing law. So now I'm a full-time writer, and up until 3 years ago, I was practicing law. When I was practicing, I was writing also. And what I would do is I would work all day. I had this day job, and for some reason, my law firm expected me to work for them during the day. So I figured 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, I could write for myself. And so typically what I would do is I would work all day, have some dinner, and then come up to my writing room and write for 2 or 3 hours. Once I retired, I switched it around. And now what I do is I get up in the morning, I write all morning, like I said, until my stomach tells me it's lunchtime. I go have lunch, and then I come back and I either write a little bit more, but what I'll likely do in the afternoon is spend a lot of time on the business of books. As you know, Michael, so much of what we do is like running a small business, basically ourselves as authors. So yeah, that is definitely a factor for me. Now, you were a journalist, and you are a very actively involved in theater. And I have to say, I loved listening to you read the portion of your chapter, because I mean, you really drew me in the way an actor would. But how do you find your journalism and theater backgrounds? How does that either help or hinder you as a writer?
It helps. One question I've had so many times promoting both of these books is it hard for a man to write a female main character? And I think my background as an actor is really what helped me there, because as an actor, of course, you have to empathize with your characters to some degree. Actually, I would say to a great degree. So, when I'm writing Livy, it's pretty easy to sort of get in her mindset as if I was playing her. Now, I would be a terrible choice to play her if there was ever a film of that. But I think that really helps. And as far as the journalism goes, I mostly did feature writing, and I just think journalism is something you're telling other people's stories, and that's basically what you do when you're writing novels. I mean, for me, this whole thing is, acting and to an extent journalism, but mostly acting and then writing is just scratches that creative itch, which if I didn't have that outlet, I would go crazy, because it's the creative itch is powerful.
It's funny you say that, because people would ask me before, how could you possibly work as a lawyer for 10 or 12 hours a day, take a break for an hour or two, and then go and write? And it was actually easy as anything, because it's such a different activity. You're really using a different side of the brain. I don't know if that's the left side or the right side. I never could figure that out. But you really are using a different side of your brain, and it really is an entirely different thing. And to me, I always found it very refreshing. I mean, there were times I would have to just stop myself at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning when I was cruising along, because I knew I was going to have to get up in 5 or 6 hours, and it was going to wreck my next day. But it really is an entirely different experience than the workaday world that we typically work in.
I certainly admire your discipline, and I think a lot of first-time novelists, debut novelists, have stories like that. I remember writing the first draft of Spitfire, sitting in a waiting room while my daughter was taking a ballet class. And I remember the specific chapter. It turned out to be a pretty good chapter. But let me ask you another question, Joel. So why did you gravitate towards the thriller genre? And I'm always interested to see what other writers like. Who's influenced you?
I like thrillers. I mean, that's sort of the long and short of it. It's something that I enjoy reading, and because I like reading thrillers, it was something that I just found myself writing. I happen to like legal thrillers in particular, and I like John Grisham and Scott Truro and Lisa Scottolini and other people who write legal thrillers. So I thought, well, write what you know. I know something about the law, and I think I can write this in an exciting and fictional way. And that's what I did. And the other thing I noticed was that there was very, very little that was done as an environmental legal thriller. Grisham has written 3 of them, The Appeal, Pelican Brief, and Gray's Mountain. And there's very, very few other books that are out there that deal with environmental issues in a legal thriller. My view is, one thing I really try to do in my books, and I've done it in both of my current books as well as in Strange Fire, is I try to educate people. And by educate, I don't mean preach, and I don't mean beat you over the head, but I really want people to come away from my book saying, wow, I didn't know that. I just learned something really interesting. Well, let me ask you a question, because it's something that I found fascinating, and I thought about it in the context of another story that I've been playing with, and that is Ian Fleming. I read your book and I saw the name Ian Fleming, and I thought, isn't that interesting? Michael is using a name that's a name that I'm familiar with, Ian Fleming, and he's a character in the story. And then I looked it up and I saw that it was the Ian Fleming, the guy who wrote the James Bond books. And because I asked you once before, but how is it that, first of all, did Ian Fleming really do some of these things? Was he really a spy master and a spy? And secondly, how did you feel about writing Ian Fleming into your story?
He did do some of the things that are in my book. This is, just so you know, in the war, World War II, he was in naval intelligence. He was the assistant to the director of naval intelligence. And he was sort of a planner. He didn't go out in the field. He wasn't James Bond by any means. And then after the war, he went back to journalism, which was his field. And he ran these foreign correspondents for the Sunday Times and other British papers. And he said that many of his correspondents sent information back to MI6, which is the British Secret Intelligence Service. Fleming said this several times. At one point, he may have said it as a tax write-off. He was working for the government when he was actually working in private business, but nevertheless, he said it, and I ran with it. In fact, one of the things that inspired him to be in the book and is that it's true. You see it in Spitfire and Nightshade. In his office, he had this huge map of the world with little light bulbs that would light up where he had a correspondent for the Sunday Times. And I thought, my God, he's like M, in the Bond novels. It was difficult, because Fleming, well, I think the Bond novels and the Bond films are kind of apples and oranges. Quite frankly, there's a lot of racism and sexism and homophobia in the novels. There's some progressive stuff too, I think, but there is still some of that. So it was interesting to have someone like Fleming, who does represent that sort of privileged English class, opposite someone like Livy, who is a very direct woman who is not by any means a Bond girl. So that was what was interesting to me.
Did you find it, were you concerned at all about writing about a real person? Now Ian Fleming, I saw, died in 1964, so he's been gone a long time. But even so, he's a real person, and there's probably still an estate out there collecting huge royalties from the James Bond movies and the like.
Oh,
were you concerned at all about writing about somebody who, in fact, was a live, breathing person?
Now, the Ian Fleming Foundation is quite a, they have a lot of irons and a lot of fires with Bond and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which he wrote as well, which a lot of people don't know. Not really, because
he wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
He did, yeah. He was in the hospital. He had heart problems. That's why he died so young. And he had a heart attack, and he wanted to write something in the hospital to take his mind off it. And so he wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Okay.
Yeah, and he had a son as well. So I think he wrote something for his son, although apparently he wasn't a terrific father. But I'd seen Fleming in several other books where he was sort of portrayed as a surrogate Bond. And I thought, that doesn't work. That's not what he was like. And so I thought, naturally, hubris, I thought that I could do it a little bit better. So yeah, no, I wasn't terribly worried. One of my favorite authors, James Elroy, who writes historical fiction. I mean, savages, people like, the Kennedys and various other historical figures. Now, obviously, I'm not James Elroy, but that never came up, talking with my editor or publisher, that concern about that. And Fleming is portrayed, I think, reasonably well and accurately, I hope, in the books.
Well, as a lawyer, I can tell you that, without giving you legal advice, I can tell you that the defense to defamation always is the truth. So long as what you stated is somewhat truthful, you're probably in good shape.
Yes, I hope so. So we're both writing series. We're both at number 2 in the series. You're working on the third one. So do you kind of see your series continuing on as long as there's interest? Do you have an end in sight? Have you planned it?
I have book number 3 done. That's called Strange Fire. I've started book number 4 called The Firebrand. And in the meantime, I've written a number of other books. I've now written 4 books. I've completed 4 manuscripts that are not Mike Jacobs books. And the novel that I'm finishing up right now is not a Mike Jacobs book either. So I think I'll probably return to Mike from time to time, and we'll tune in on him. He's actually aging along with us. So in a lot of books, quite a few series, the main character just never ages. He or she is always the same age. And in my book, though, Mike has started out at 26, and then he's 28, and in the next book he's 29. So he is aging along with us in our time. So, you know, if I go back to Mike in a few years, he might be in his mid-30s, and if we're all both around that long, you know, I'll get him in his 40s as well. But in any event, I do like writing about Mike. I like him a lot as a character. I think he's a very likable character. One of the reasons I specifically wrote Mike, and really what I do with all of my main characters, is I try to make them very human. You know, you read about some characters and they're, you know, they've got some superpower. You know, they I don't know, they have a physical strength, or they know martial arts, or they're, you know, particularly strong or big or whatever it is, you know, photographic memories and the like. And I thought to myself, I thought my readers would be interested in reading about somebody that they could relate to, so that they could say, all right, with a little bit of training, I think I could do that. And I thought that that would be much more relatable. Your character, Livy, is a very relatable person as well. I mean, she doesn't seem to have any superpowers. She seems like a normal woman, and maybe a much more open-minded and progressive woman, you know, than one would find in the mid-1940s. But to me, it was important to write about a person that was relatable. And I think Mike is a relatable character. The book I'm writing right now, which still is not titled, although could be called Project Oslo for now. My main character is a woman, and her name is Anna Freeman. And I wanted to make her relatable as well too, because again, I just felt that, you know, I could give her superpowers, and I just decided that, you know, I felt that readers, you know, there are places you can go to read about superheroes, and that's not my books. So I hope Mike will continue for a long time to come, and I'm going to return to him from time to time. Like I said, book 3 is done. Book 4 is about half done, but I'm also working on some other books as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, always nice to have, you know, many projects as a writer, or at least
Right.
projects you're thinking about.
Well, you know, and we both know, and there's certainly many writers out there. Daniel Silva's books, he's got to have written, oh gosh, 30 or so books, and you know, following Gabriel Allon all the way through, you know, from being a young man now to being the chief of Mossad in Israel, and other books as well just follow the same character all the way through. I attended a really interesting Zoom program with John Grisham, and somebody asked him the question, how do you manage to keep your characters so lively and unique and interesting and different? And he said, because I don't write series. He said, if you look back across my books, he said, of all the 25 or 30 books that I've written, really you'd only call maybe 2 or 3 of them series where there's a follow-on book. He said, but every other book is a unique book that is not a part of a series. And so therefore, he said, whenever I'm writing about a new person, that person is unique and interesting and different. And I don't have to worry about that person getting, you know, seeming tired or old or same old, same old. So I liked what Grisham had to say. And not that I'm anywhere near as good as Grisham, but I'll certainly adopt what he was saying.
Yes, he's a good one to take advice from. Absolutely.
Well, let me ask you a question, because one of the things you mentioned before is that you like historical fiction, and that's very apparent from your stories. But I'm curious about the kind of research that you had to do to write this, to write both of these books. I think all of us are familiar with, we've seen a million World War II movies of about everything from every kind of perspective. We've read books about World War II. We've read about the Cold War. You know, we've read all this stuff about the Cold War, and all of those spy books that we came to know and love over the years. They all take place in the 50s and in the 60s. And in fact, the James Bond books is a great example. It's the Cold War era. And but you're writing about a unique slice in time. You're writing about the era, at least in the 2 books that we're talking about tonight, in the middle 1940s. It's not World War II anymore, but the Cold War isn't entirely there yet. And how did you research that? And what do you do for the research for that kind of a book to give it authenticity? Because to me, your book felt very authentic.
Well, thank you very much. Well, on the World War II side, I would say the past decade, we're sort of living in a heyday of new research about World War II, and especially about the role of women actively involved in combat and behind the scenes in combat. And so a lot of really good people, really smart people have written some terrific nonfiction books that I avail myself of. My favorite bit of research that I tell every time I do one of these events and someone asks me is through the course of writing the first draft, I got to know a veteran of World War II, a French veteran of World War II. His name is Andre Rocher. He just turned 100 last month. He is a miracle. He gets around by himself. He takes language classes at the local YWCA to improve his English. He is a marvel. So when I needed to find out if you're on the streets in Paris in 1946, where would you use a phone? Well, they're pay phones. Andre, where do you use a phone? I call him, he's a charming, wonderful man. So yeah, that's the kind of research you did, but eventually, research can be the great procrastinator. And especially historical research. And at some point, you've got to put it away and start writing the book, because the story trumps the research. I mean, I remember Nightshade, I was obsessed with how would Livy get from London to Washington, D.C. in 1947. I looked everywhere and finally found a website with the exact flight plan. This laborious 24-hour journey that went, up to Ireland and then to New York, and then you take the train to DC. And I put sort of a synopsis of that in Nightshade. My editor said, nobody cares about this. Get rid of it. And that's true. Some things you're like, but it needs to be there. You need to know that because probably someone reading your book may know. And the last thing you want to do is have something that feels so anachronistic that takes the reader out of the story.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned some of that. Fortunately for me, I developed a large cadre of friends in different specialties. In this book, in A Mid-Rage, there are a couple of blasting scenes. We hear about the aftermath of one blast, but there's a very significant and important scene that deals with blasting of a high wall in a strip mine. And I have a friend, a former client actually, who is a licensed blaster, and he did that for 30 years. So I called up Ron and I said, hey, Ron, tell me again, what's the name of the substance that you used to do the blasting? And he said, ammonium nitrate fuel oil. I only told you that 100 times. I said, okay. And then, and the plunger thingy. And he said, it's not called the plunger thingy. It's called a detonator. It's not called a detonator. It's called a blaster. He said, so he was very careful with me to make sure I used the right terminology. By the way, and for kids out there, if you ever Google ammonium nitrate fuel oil, be prepared to get some interesting things coming back to you afterwards, because there are people out there keeping an eye on people who Google the words ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. So
you may get stopped at an airport. Is that what you're saying? If you Google that?
Well, not only is it used for blasting a high wall so that you can blast it down and get to the coal underneath, it's also used for any other kind of blasting, even nefarious blasting. By the way, when you go on Amazon, I was just curious. I went on Amazon at one point and I typed in ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, and there are actually people who will sell that to you right off of Amazon. So I don't know, go figure. But yes, you have to be careful when you're doing that kind of research. But fortunately for us, we know people, and that helps to add a lot of authenticity to it. So that's a great thing. Well, I'm wondering. Yeah,
I want to see if there are questions out there.
I was just going to say, Stephanie, if you have any questions for us, we can keep talking. But if you have any questions, this would be a great time to jump in and ask them for us.
Yeah, perfect timing. We don't have any questions from the audience, but I have questions, and then the audience may chime in here in a moment as well. But first I want to say that I just appreciate how well you two have interviewed each other. I've just learned a lot by listening to the two of you, and it's been great. So thank you so much for that. And I'll just go ahead and say it, Joel, for giving us another reason not to shop at Amazon. If they're just selling people.
Be the ammonium nitrate.
Right, just willy-nilly. So You've both talked a little bit about your process, and Joel, it sounds like you have a real sort of discipline in terms of waking up early and writing, and so Michael, though I wonder if you might give us a little insight into your sort of day to day. I'm just always interested in hearing how writers approach, and we know some people are plotters and some people are pantsers, and so I just wonder if you'd be interested in sharing any more about that.
I am a pantser. I've tried to be a plotter, and it bores me to tears. I'm making outlines. I just go, what is the point? Plus, I like to surprise myself when I'm writing and go, well, what would logically happen here? What would the characters do? One of my favorite scenes in Spitfire came out of that very moment. The problem with being if those who are watching, if you don't know what a pantser is, it's someone who does an outline. They're flying by the seat of their pants, and and sometimes you wish you had more pants, because you do write yourself into corners and you go, oh my God, what was I thinking? Oh, I can't do that. But it's just the way that I work best, and for better or worse, I got to stick with it, I guess.
Yeah, let me throw in my 2 cents. I was talking with the writer Stephen James about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he's a great writer, New York Times bestseller. He's also a pantser, but he doesn't call it that. He calls it organic. He says he writes organically. That sounds a little fancy schmancy, but it's the same thing. And that's the way I write most of the time too. There are times that I'll have something complicated, and I need things to go from A to B to C, and it's got to go in a very specific way, a very particular way. Things have got to happen that way, and I might outline that. And then for the most part, though, I have in my mind things that I want to have happen in the book. I might even jot down a few bullet points of things that I know have to happen, and I will know within a couple of thousand words how the end of my story is going to go. I listened to a lecture with Lee Child, who of course has written phenomenally well as Jack Reacher stories. And somebody asked him this exact question. They said, are you a pantser or are you an outliner? Because the only thing I know before I start writing my book is my first paragraph. He said, after that, he said, I have no clue how my book is going to go or even how it's going to end. Now you could say, Lee Child, you don't know anything about writing. But of course, the statistics tell us otherwise. He knows something about writing and obviously can do it pretty well. And but I think most writers do have an endpoint. Most writers do have a goal, whether they write it down and outline it, or whether they just know it. But
just to that point, I'm going to say something that might be controversial, but plot sometimes really bores me. I really like the characters so much more. And I find my editors occasionally have said to me, okay, now what? Now here you said this happened, and now you're saying this didn't happen. And I don't say to them, I don't really care. But people, readers do. I mean, I think it's one of the famous stories about Raymond Chandler, of course, who wrote Philip Marlowe novels, is that even Chandler didn't know who killed one character in The Big Sleep. And I think so. I guess my point is that pantsing or writing organically hopefully lends itself to a focus on the characters more, maybe, at least in my case.
Well, let me again just throw in my 2 cents on that, and that is that when we write these characters, the characters very often are telling us what their words are, what they want to say. And I can't begin to tell you that I start a chapter out and I sort of know where I want it to go, but my characters are almost dictating to me. And I don't want to sound like I'm psycho or schizo or anything like that, but the fact of the matter is that very often they do talk to you. They do tell you. And part of it is, of course, your mental process, which is imagining what your character would be doing under these circumstances. But you just allow the circumstances to dictate how your character is going to react. And I think that makes it more interesting. It makes it more lively. It makes it more real. And as a result, I think it makes for a better book. I think you can get really bogged down in an outline. And while there's certainly some great authors, who are out there who write from an outline, there are many, many great writers who completely eschew an outline.
And it's interesting that you say that, because that actually leads to my next question, because the other thing that I always like to hear about from authors is how their characters live with them and vice versa. And you've mentioned, hearing your characters' voices and having them speak to you. And so I'm curious about, especially since you're writing a series, you have at least one character who has ostensibly, I would imagine, has taken up residence, fairly permanently, right? And then so from both of you, though, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that and about how the voice comes to you, and the other specific curiosity I always have is like, where those characters are in between, right? When you're not actually writing about them, and what it looks like to sort of, if you have to resurrect them when you come back, or if they're always kind of there in the background.
Do you want to get started on that, Michael?
No, Joel, go ahead.
Sure. When I'm writing, and I'm writing a book right now, my characters are with me 24/7. And they really are. I mean, I can wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I'll have a whole scene constructed in my mind, or at least I'll have paragraphs constructed in my mind. I have a book, it's right here. I'll take my book and I will write down a few words. I've actually learned to go into the bathroom and turn on the bathroom light and write. I used to try to write in the dark, and then I couldn't read it the next day. So I'll write down a few words of what my character is whispering in my ear. But and it may not be my protagonist. It could be often is other characters as well who are speaking to you. If you don't write, you can't really appreciate this, but I suspect that all writers experience this, and that is sort of the mystery and the majesty, really, of having your characters talk to you. And it's just an awesome thing, because you do have this, it's not a dialogue, but you hear from your characters. And I was writing, I've been writing this novel now for the past couple of months, and so often it goes in a direction that's very different than the direction I started out going in the morning. And often that's simply because the characters are pulling in that direction. Michael had mentioned how, you imagine a scene, and the scene may be very different by the end of the time that you've written from the beginning. But just the easiest way I can describe it is, if you just simply thought to yourself, okay, my character is going into a country bar. Well, then you have to say, and that's all that you may know, but you can think to yourself, well, what's the bartender like? Is it a man or a woman? How's he or she dressed? What's the bar like? It's a country bar. Is it a fancy bar, or is there linoleum everywhere? On the walls, are there, stuffed deer heads? Is there cheap wood paneling there, or is it nicer? And what's the smell like? We all remember that smell, especially from college years, of the stale beer. Does it smell like that, or does it smell like a nicer place? And how is that bar different than the bar in France in 1946? So in many ways, we imagine a scene, and then the scene, because of our imaginations, the scene kind of, we see the scene, and we're just writing what we're seeing. How about you, Michael?
Yeah, it comes from my theater background. I mean, that's what we do in the theater. What's the background of your character? What were you doing before your character came on stage? What will your character do when they go off stage? Plus, I also direct. I teach at a university, and I occasionally direct. And so when you're directing, you're sort of, playing all the parts sort of in your head. And that's a little bit like writing a novel. And one thing I do sometimes is I will say, okay, if I'm making a film of this novel, who would I cast as all the characters? That is so much fun. And in some cases, it really helps me kind of define, because I kind of know what that actor can do. And it sort of helps me find something about that character. But usually it's just my acting background. I'm sort of playing all the characters in my head.
And Michael, do the characters stay with you? Do they, how do you find, what is your relationship with them, I guess?
It's weird, the old writing mantra of write what you know. And here I am, a middle-aged guy from North Carolina writing about a 20-something British woman in the 40s. That's sort of, how do you know that? How can you be honest and truthful in that? But a lot of these books really come from, there's a lot of me in this books. And surprisingly enough, there's a lot of me in Livy. And that's something I believe as an actor, there has to be something of you in every part you play. So absolutely, characters like Livy, I find now when I start to write her, she's there because she's sort of, I guess, part of me in a way.
Yeah, I think your characters are sitting sort of in a waiting room. And when you write them, and then you do as I've done now, and I've written 3 novels since my last Mike Jacobs book. Mike is still there. I mean, he's sitting in the waiting room waiting for me to tap him on the shoulder and say, "Come on, Mike, we need you again." And then he'll get up and I mean, when you live with these characters for long enough, they really become your imaginary friends. And so they're just sitting there waiting for you. And when you need them again, and they're very patient, by the way, too. And sometimes, by the way, and I'm sure Michael's experiences, sometimes when they're impatient and they're telling you about a story that they want you to write, that's an awesome thing, because all of a sudden this story is just coming to you and you've just got to sit down and start writing it. And that's a very awesome thing. But otherwise, the characters are sitting in the waiting room and just waiting for you. And when you're ready for them, they're ready for you, and it's a great thing.
Nice. Well, that's actually the hour has flown, and so that makes a nice note to end on. I just want to thank you both for the great conversation and for sharing your work with us and your time with us, and remind folks to pick up your books from Malaprops and or their local independent bookseller. And thank you so much again for sharing with us this evening. I think it's been particularly nice for aspiring writers who tune in. Picked up some nice tidbits and learned a few things there as well. So thank you,
Stephanie. It's as a North Carolinian, it's a real privilege to be doing something with Malaprops, and we appreciate that, the work you do.
Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. And everyone out there, please buy your books from Malaprops or another independent bookseller, but especially Malaprops, because it's so easy to do. You just click on their link and you can buy the book. It's that easy, and they'll be happy to send it to you.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated to all. And everyone out there, please stay safe and stay well. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.